Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well, and I hope you're going to go and get yourself something really refreshing to drink, because I've got a lovely story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, to click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the double-storey red-bricked houses on the street were all alike, boasting red walls, double-hung sash windows, and grey slate roofs. The classical houses boasted an architecture with a timeless appeal. They had been new additions to this neighbourhood, not too far from the town of Whitmore in South Carolina, over 30 long years ago. At that time, the local area had been heavily fringed by sprawling woodgroves, many that had since been bulldozed to make way for more housing developments. This illustrious neighbourhood was up and coming, even 30 years ago, where fabulous trees planted on either side of the street were merely inconspicuous saplings, but over the years they had miraculously transformed themselves into lofty, towering oaks that dappled the street in a pleasing shade. The neighbourhood had grown more beautiful in recent years, as the yards had matured and the trees grown exponentially. Also, with time, the red-bricked houses had lost that new look. The bright red bricks had faded to a more mellow red colour, and the houses, having been occupied for 30 years, now contained in their walls the memories of lives well lived. And so they too had gained a history, which gave them an aura of mystery and intrigue. As with the advancing of age comes a beauty that a brand new house can never replicate, try as it might. For indeed, an empty book with no written pages can never hold your attention, nor can it prickle your emotions. It fails to be interesting. But a house that has held the souls of people within its very bowels will contain within its walls a kaleidoscope of colourful secrets, and the residents at number 53 had a secret to tell, and an interesting one at that. It all began 30 long years ago, when Scarlett Everdeen and her husband Mason had purchased number 53. Suffice to say, buying a house had been a great deal to Scarlett. She was determined to raise her family in an exquisite environment, and these red-bricked houses held the potential of so much promise. "I just love it," she'd said to her husband when they'd first laid their eyes on number 53. "But can we really afford it? I mean, we're first-time property buyers, aren't we? And the price is so steep." Her husband, on seeing the animated look on his wife's face, as her eyes remained longingly fixed on the house, with the same kind of attachment as a little girl would have, holding a baby puppy in her hands that she wants to keep. That was the kind of look on Scarlett's face, and there was no way that Mason could refuse his wife's dreams. It would have taken a brave man to say no to her. He was determined that come what may, he could afford the house, even though his pockets were shallow. But where there's a will, there is always a way. Somehow he would make it happen for Scarlett, for he loved nothing better than to see his wife smile. "Of course we can afford it," he had insisted. Against all the odds, Mason had managed to find the kind of job that could give his wife Scarlett the life she'd always dreamed of. They were by no means wealthy, but how much do you really need in life if you have a good home, a nice car, and a reasonable amount of money in the bank? Then life can be very good indeed. Excess wealth was like having too many baked beans stashed away in the store cupboard that long after you've gone, someone else will get to enjoy. Scarlett had not had an easy childhood by any manner of means, but she was determined that the future for her family was going to be a bright and rosy one. Little did she know that when her children were in their teens, that someone would be silently waiting in the wings, loitering around with the stealth of a black panther, watching her every move and waiting to pounce on her when she least suspected it. And this would be the kind of enemy that you never saw coming. Little did Scarlett know, someone held in their heart such a burning hatred for her that like a malignant, cruel cancer was beginning to grow and grow and grow, and would eventually get out of control. And then all hell would break loose, and the life she loved so dearly might be ripped away from her like a ladder in a pair of tights. But sometimes fate has other ideas in mind that can end up surprising us all. It all began shortly after old Mrs. Prt1 had died. She had been a delightful old dear, and one of those people like a perennial flower seemed to emerge after an icy cold winter, brighter than ever before, and on true seasonal form. She would always leave town in the colder months of the year, to return to South Carolina in spring, like a cheerful bush of colourful pink peonies. Nobody in town knew where she went for the winter months, and most did not care to ask, for fear of being intrusively rude or prying. They hoped she would volunteer the information for herself, and tell them about her exotic adventure or summer location, perhaps on a fabulous cruise somewhere. But she never did. She was the kind of person you just thought would live for ever and ever and ever, just like the tenacious rosebush you had in your yard for years and years, that awakens in the summer in a blaze of fabulous colour, that you never imagine for a single moment might not be around any more. That was the way the townsfolk felt about Prt1. She was reassuring, a constant, like the oak trees that fringed the pavement, that were always reliably there. In the last 10 years, since Scarlett had known Petra, the old woman had not changed at all. She looked old for sure, but always exactly the same, her corrugated face beset with a road map of wrinkles, and loose jowls that hung under her chin, like a turkey's neck. But they never deepened as you might expect, nor did they get any saggier. Instead, she stayed exactly the same, with no noticeable gradual deterioration that you often find in older people. Some that shrink, and sometimes even shrivel up like an old potato, but not Petra, never Petra. She was immune to that physical decline. Scarlett thought it might have been due to her zealous and robust passion for life, and the fact that she claimed that she still felt she was 21. "I might look old, dear," she would say, "but I don't feel any different to how I felt when I was 25 years old." She would peer at Scarlett through her wizened blue eyes, that in certain lights became a silvery grey. She would say, "How are you, dear?" in her sing-song little voice when she greeted Scarlett every morning from over the white wicker fence. "I'm fine," Scarlett would say, "absolutely fine." It would seem that Petra was slight of frame, but robustly strong for one so old. Petra would be quick to point out that age was only a number, and you were only as old as you feel. "It's a state of mind, dear," she'd say. "If you think you're about to pop your clogs, then you most certainly will. I've seen it with many of my older friends, you know." Every morning, as regular as clockwork, Petra could be found doing some odd jobs in her yard, and she would industriously buzz around with as much industrious vigour as the bees and butterflies that pollinated her flowers. That old woman had energy beyond her years, and was not afraid of genuine hard work that younger generations would be quick to shun. Let's just say that Petra's yard was the pride of the neighbourhood, for that woman had green fingers that were the envy of all the townsfolk. Once Scarlett had dropped off some of her dying pot plants to hand over to her elderly neighbour, in the hope that she could resurrect her beleaguered plants from their grim impending fate. And Petra had returned her plants to her with bountiful glossy foliage and a plethora of flowers. Scarlett had clandestinely thought that Petra must have a fabulous magic wand somewhere around, that she secretly cast over her plants, as they were the healthiest and most vibrant specimens in the entire neighbourhood. One glance at the cottage-style flowers that burst through the flower beds of her front lawn, where a tangle of daisies, delphiniums, larkspurs, zinnias, and so many other colourful blooms would pop through the earth in a perfect symmetry, and would make you realise that this organised chaos was created by a master gardener, who made her masterpieces look effortless. Scarlett knew that anyone who was a master at their craft made things look so easy, like a proficient diver or a phenomenal adept athlete, that made their skilled accomplishments seem so seamless, but no one knows how many hours are devoted to create such polished synchronicity. Petra had spent many long hours in her yard, creating the quintessential perfect Garden of Eden that had inspired many of the admiring locals to visit her yard, to admire her dazzling floral displays. Petra was dearly loved by the local community, but one morning the 90-year-old woman did not seem to be bobbing her head over the white wicker fence to greet Scarlett with her usual big smile, which sounded warning bells for Scarlett, who knew at once that something was terribly wrong, and decided to check up on her friend Petra Stewart. It was Scarlett who found Petra lying on the bottom of the staircase with a packet of dianthus seeds in her hands. She had broken her neck and had died whilst doing something she loved to do. It seemed symbolic, her dying with a packet of seeds in her hands, almost reminiscent of the whole life and death cycle. Soon after Petra had died, her red-bricked house was put up for sale and was snapped up on the very day it was on show by an eager, enthusiastic buyer, a single woman of about similar age to Scarlett, with the name Constance Cunningham. It would seem that come hell or high water, nothing would stop Constance from buying this house. There is something about living in a small town that makes people interested in their neighbours, and Scarlett was not immune to this curiosity. She was eager to see who this woman was who had demanded to buy the house next door. Word on the grapevine from the estate agent's nephew is the woman gave his uncle a sizable cheque, or if one is being less polite, a backhander or bribe, as an incentive to ensure he put off all other home buyers from buying the property so she could have first refusal. Let's just say with a yard like Petra's, eager buyers were champing at the bit to purchase the place. To give Constance her due, she had paid the full asking price for the property, but with so many interested parties on the wings, the price could so easily have climbed steadily onwards and upwards, acquiring a sizable profit. Scarlett rightly assumed the new owner of number 54 must be quite a pushy, self-assured person who knew how to manipulate people to their own advantage, a shrewd woman who didn't suffer fools gladly. These were characteristics so alien to someone as noble, polite, and honourable as Scarlett. She couldn't resist peering through the curtains to have a good old gawk at her new neighbour. "I'm not being nosy," she told herself. "I'm just being interested. There's nothing wrong with showing a healthy interest in your environment." The sage green removal van was parked outside the house next door, but there was a rather disappointing showing of furniture that was being evacuated from the rear of the van by two hefty-looking men. Much of the stuff that the van unveiled had clearly seen happier days, and looked like it had been bought at a yard sale. It was peculiar for the furniture to be so tattered and forlorn, for someone moving into such a prestigious neighbourhood. Maybe this woman had scraped the barrel to buy the beautiful house next door, but didn't have enough surplus cash to splash out on furnishings. Or perhaps she was a miserly penny pincher who didn't like to spend her money and bought everything she owned from thrift stores and yard sales and spent her entire life dumpster diving to cut down on supermarket bills. Scarlett observed all the pitiful-looking furniture that emerged from the back of the van. She noticed an old dresser made from cheap-looking plywood, a kitchen table that looked like it had been used for kids' paint classes, and a sorry-looking set of faded settee furniture that had been badly bleached by the sun. It was moments later that she laid her eyes on the new neighbour for the very first time. The woman had a gaunt, emaciated-looking face, a pointed jaw, a beaked nose, with deep-set dark eyes that seemed almost cold, hard, calculating. The woman was unnaturally thin. She reminded Scarlett of a bundle of chopsticks covered in crepe paper, but her posture was straight, and she walked gracefully, with a determined gait. She was wearing a pair of black slacks, sensible pumps, and a white cotton shirt. When she talked to the large burly man, who was bringing in the cheap-looking featherlight furniture into the house, her manner seemed brusque, even a wee bit condescending, as if she had a superior attitude. "I don't like her," thought Scarlett in disappointment. "I don't like her sad-looking furniture, and I don't like her." Scarlett did not usually judge anyone on first impressions. She was the first to know you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. But there was something about Constance Cunningham that irked her and gave her the chills. Let's just say her former neighbourly, magnanimous thoughts of dropping over to the house with a casserole and a bottle of wine to welcome Constance Cunningham to the neighbourhood were put on the back burner, as Scarlett decided she didn't want to meet this woman, and avoidance of this new neighbour would be a worthwhile strategy to endorse. But living in a small town, sooner or later they were bound to cross paths, especially with the woman living next door to her. Why couldn't she have moved somewhere else, Scarlett thought. And furthermore, why did old Mrs. Petra Stewart have to die? Constance Cunningham had moved into the red-bricked house at long last. She had her eyes fixed on this house for years, but when the old bat seemed to refuse to die, she had stealthily snuck into that house through the back kitchen window, which had been a tight squeeze, but Constance being so skinny, she could literally climb through any small opening that she wanted to. That would make most people come unstuck. She had clandestinely laid in wait for the old lady, like a cougar hiding out on a tree, waiting to pounce on its unsuspecting victim. She had stealthily hidden in a closet upstairs that stank to high heaven of mothballs and lavender. It had been so claustrophobic in that confined space that she thought she was going to give herself away by sneezing loudly, as the insufferable taste of those god-awful mothballs was now sticking to the back of her throat. If she wasn't careful, she could end up dying prematurely from mothball asphyxiation, she had thought. She had heard Petra Stewart muttering away to herself, something about some seedlings she wanted to plant. Anyone could see the silly old dear was fixated over her yard. Constance had watched her year after year, month after month, spending copious amounts of time in the yard, singing away happily to herself. On one occasion, she had been so desperate for the old woman to die, she'd slipped some insect repellent into the milk on the doorstep, which had turned bright blue. No doubt the old woman had never drunk it, more's the shame. She knew what she was to do next. That would be foolproof. No one would ever suspect an old woman falling to her death from a staircase to be remotely suspicious. I mean, the woman was 90, for goodness sake. Everyone would expect her to die at some point, would they not? The locals in town would all just assume she had slipped down the staircase and had a nasty fall. It had been so much easier than she ever envisaged possible. Constance had discreetly tiptoed behind Petra as the shuffling, ungainly woman descended the staircase, failing to hear her stealth-like approach. Petra had cautiously snailed her way down that staircase with her seeds in her left hand, while clutching the staircase railing with her right hand. Constance crept behind the woman, pushed her hard, and for a moment she had been airborne. Then her body had crashed on the parquet floor with a mighty thud, and Constance had heard a strange snapping sound. Finally, when she examined the old woman lying on the floor, her eyes glazed over, mouth open, and body lying at a peculiar angle, she was satisfied that at long last the old bat was dead. "I've done her a favour," she told herself. "I've put her out of her misery, like an old cat or dog that has been euthanized by the vet." Constance had stealthily slipped out of Petra's house like a cat burglar and crawled under the fence to the rear of the property, taking a shortcut through the woods to the road beyond, where her car lay in wait for her. She was feeling victorious. Now she would wait patiently for number 54 to come on the market, and bingo, she'd be living in the house next to the woman she'd been waiting to avenge for so many years. Scarlett Everdeen had ruined her life. Now it was payback time. Life could be a bitch, and Scarlett was about to find out all about that, and revenge was a dish best served cold. But she would bide her time, strike when the iron was hot and the moment was ripe. Constance had one thing going for her. She had lots of time on her hands and plenty of patience. Constance thought back with annoyance about all the wasted years she had spent in a mental hospital, thanks to Doris Riley. That woman had been determined to have her institutionalized. Thank God she was finally out of the way, and much like Petra Stewart's death, no one had suspected a single thing. She had fiddled with Doris's brakes, and the woman had been unable to stop her car in time, and had ploughed head first into a truck when she had gone whirling through a red light. Constance had observed the whole accident, following Doris's car behind at a safe distance. She had watched it all, the ambulance arriving on the scene, strapping Doris onto a gurney and covering her head with a blanket. The EMTs were shaking their heads sadly. She, on the other hand, had rubbed her hands with glee. 2 gone, just 1 to go, and then finally the depths of her wrath would be settled. The doctors at the psychiatric hospital had medicated her to the nines with a large cocktail of drugs that made her feel so sluggishly sleepy. There had been times when she'd been strapped to gurneys, injected with all measure of medications that would knock her out for many days. Sometimes she'd been callously locked up in a cell all on her own, as the doctors believed she posed a danger to herself and to the community. She'd been medicated with tranquilizers, antipsychotic drugs, tremor medications like stelazine and prolixin to calm down the violent side of her character. She had been diagnosed with intermittent violent disorder and schizophrenia, which she'd been told by her doctor meant that there was a breakdown between her thoughts, emotions and behaviour, giving her a faulty perception, inappropriate actions, a withdrawal from reality, mental fragmentation, fantasy and illusion. Those bloody doctors had no clue what they were talking about. Constance knew that there was nothing wrong with her, nothing at all. Thank God she'd been given the all clear to live a free life in society, provided she remained on her meds. Did they really think she was going to go through life feeling only half alive? They were sorely mistaken about that. Every month those pills were flushed down the toilet without apology. Never before had Scarlett felt so vibrant as she did now. Things were looking up in her life, and she was feeling exceedingly happy about that. But now, like a snake sensing the closeness of its prey on its tongue, she could feel that Scarlett, the victim of her wrath, was now in close proximity. There would be a measure of calm before the storm. She would wait for the perfect opportunity to destroy Scarlett's life, but she would bide her time. It was important that, like all the other fortuitous deaths she had so cunningly orchestrated, that no one suspected a thing. Scarlett. In the days that followed, Scarlett felt increasingly uneasy about the woman living next door to her. There was something so familiar about her, but she couldn't put a finger on it. Then she realized that the woman living next door to her was a dead ringer for her late sister Ella. That would explain why she'd experienced an instant dislike to the woman. It was those haunting dark eyes, the beaked nose, the angular chin, made all the worse by the woman's painful skinniness. She had remembered the relief she and her mother had felt when over 10 years ago they finally learnt that Ella was dead. Ostensibly, both mother and daughter had felt bad about celebrating Ella finally being gone, but that woman was a dangerous liability, and when a predator that has been a threat to you for so long is taken out of your midst, of course you're going to feel a great deal of relief. Doris had received the letter from the mental institution, along with the ashes of her daughter, which she and her mother had thrown over a pretty lake in South Carolina. The letter had read, "Dear Mrs. Riley, I'm sorry to inform you of the tragic passing of your beloved daughter, Ella Riley. I regret to inform you that on Tuesday last, your daughter was found hanging in her hospital cell. At the time, we did not believe she posed a suicide risk to herself. The medications had been managing her condition very favourably, and as we informed you, she was due to be released from our facility in a week's time. We had been delighted with her remarkable progress, and deemed her no longer a risk to herself, or anyone else for that matter. We were about to locate her into a halfway house facility, but that was sadly not to be. It seemed that your daughter's mental condition somehow relapsed, which has been known to happen. We are sorry to be the bearer of such bad tidings, but patients with these kinds of psychotic profiles are often likely to take their own lives. We were informed you had relinquished any desire to remain in contact with your daughter. But given that your daughter is now deceased, we thought it appropriate, and we thought that it was reasonable that you might appreciate laying her ashes to rest. Once again, we are sorry for your loss, Yours sincerely, Dr. Trevor Finnegan. Scarlett remembered how she and her mother had embraced, holding each other tightly on the linoleum floor of the kitchen, refusing to let each other go. Tears had trailed down her mother's cheeks. Now they knew with certainty that they would never have to live life glancing over their shoulders, worried that Ella would come after them to seek her revenge. Only a week before Ella's demise, they had received a notification from the mental hospital informing them that Ella was to be released into the community under close evaluation from her healthcare providers and would be taking up residence in a halfway home until the facility was confident enough to believe that Ella could be independent and manage her own medications, finally weaving herself back into society to live a normal life. Doris Riley had expressed her fear to her daughter. You do know, if Ella finds us, she'll kill us both. I have no doubt about that in my mind. She told me as much. She said when she left the mental institution, she'd be after us and she'd kill us both. Scarlett had nodded. She knew her mother was right. Ella would stop at nothing to find them, if she ever got out of her confinement. That woman was clever, a masterful manipulator that could even persuade her own healthcare providers that she was fine when she was anything but. When Ella was born, she had become a precocious brat and an impossible unbridled child that was almost impossible to control and capable of so much destruction. Doris had found her putting a bag on the cat's head once when she was only 4 years old and hooting with laughter about it as the cat struggled to escape its lethal confinement. Doris had been mortified to see her child behaving like that and had promptly rehomed the cat, knowing in her heart her child could not be trusted around animals. Worse was still to come, when the fish in her fish tank were bludgeoned to death by Ella, who seemed to get great pleasure from killing anything she could get her hands on. Doris had found her daughter with an axe, standing gleefully on top of the kitchen countertops, hammering away at the fish, with an elated look on her face, inflicting not only damage on the fish themselves, but also on the kitchen sideboards that had to be replaced, as the axe had ripped them apart. When Scarlett was born, things got progressively worse. It would seem that Ella became insanely jealous of another child consuming her mother's attention, and at 5 years old, Doris had found her daughter standing over Scarlett's cot with a pillow in her hands. She was smothering Scarlett by pressing the pillow down on her daughter's face, very hard. When Doris saw what Ella was doing, her face had drained of all its colour. Her blood had boiled with rage. "What are you doing, Ella?" her mother had screamed, running over to Scarlett and tearing the pillow away from Ella's firm hold. Scarlett had gasped for air and had come so close to losing her life that day. "What the hell is wrong with you, Ella?" her mother had screamed. "You tried to kill Scarlett. You tried to kill my baby and your sister." The cold, dark eyes had turned around to look at her, with a vindictive smile on her face. "You're not right in the head, Ella," her mother had cried. "There is something seriously wrong with you. You need help, and me and your father will stop at nothing to get it for you. You cannot go around hurting your sister and innocent little animals. Normal people don't behave like that." It would seem that Scarlett's mother had stopped at nothing to try and get help from doctors and psychologists for her daughter, but no one would listen to her, as when they met Ella, she turned on the charm like the gas at a hob, seducing all the potential healthcare providers into believing that she was the quintessential perfect child that had been grossly misjudged by her parents, who had misunderstood her. To the doctor she'd say, "I'd never ever hurt my little sister. When my mummy saw me with my pillow, I was just putting it behind my sister's head. I'd never hurt her. I'm a good girl." The strangest thing of all is the doctors would believe her. People with PhDs behind their names, who had vast experience in child psychology, had fallen hook, line and sinker straight into Ella's guileful silken web. "Why, Mrs. Riley," her mother had been told over and over again, "I'm very pleased to inform you that I find nothing wrong with your daughter. You have quite the little charming girl there. She passed all my psychological evaluations with flying colours. With the greatest of respect, Mrs. Riley, I think you've misunderstood your daughter.
She's a clever girl, very intelligent. I don't think she intended to harm your little girl. It's easy for parents to become paranoid, to overreact. Maybe you took things out of context. Your daughter assured me she did not put a pillow over your daughter's face, and I believe her."
"You don't understand, Doctor," Doris had piped indignantly. "Ella is cunning. She's very bright, as you say, very eloquent, highly intelligent. She's deceived you into believing that she's normal, but I promise you she's anything but. If you lived under my roof, you would see what she's really like." It was when Ella was 14 that finally a top psychologist listened to Doris. Dr. Ralph McGregor was the top of his game. He hadn't fallen for Ella's manipulative cunning, but had seen right through it, and so Ella was finally institutionalized. In a trice it would seem her true nature was revealed to the staff, who had described her as highly dangerous. Indeed, Ella had been so violent she had attacked members of staff at the facility, bitten one of the staff members so hard that one of her own teeth had popped out of her mouth. Worse still, she had skillfully made sharp little knives from plastic cutlery, which she had used to stab one of the psychologists, whom had nearly died from the attack. So benign, benevolent human being, she certainly was not. After Ella was finally institutionalized, both Doris and her daughter continued to live in fear, dreading the day when the mental facility gave Ella the opportunity to return to normal life, under the supervision of mental health care workers. They knew Ella would be up to her old tricks again. She would deceive the doctors into believing that she had her life under control, and would persuade them that she could rigidly stick to her meds. That's all she really needed to do, and then she could be a free woman again. In the beginning, Mrs. Riley had visited her daughter at the mental hospital, but Ella had lashed out at her like a wild animal. "When I get out of here, Mother, I'll kill you, and then I'll kill Scarlet, and I'll watch you slowly die. But I will get you. I'll get out of here. You mark my words, I'll get out of here, and when I do, I will live up to my threat, and I will get you both," she had growled. And that was when Mrs. Riley had wiped her hands clean of her daughter. She had said to Scarlet, "Your sister is like an unbridled wild animal, whom is a danger to society, and most certainly to us. We can only hope that she will never get out of that place, because if she does, God help us." Scarlet tried to push away the memories of how tough her childhood had been, with the looming threat of her sister hanging over their lives like a ticking time bomb. As a little girl, she couldn't count the amount of times that Ella had pushed her, hit her, tried to submerge her under the water. Doris had tried to keep her eyes on Scarlet 24/7, but distractions always naturally arose, and when she locked up Ella in her bedroom to prevent her from doing any damage, the child became insufferable, insubordinate, and would have explosive tantrums that were so terrifying. It was hardly a wonder that by the time Scarlet was 2 years old, their father had actually divorced Doris. He couldn't cope with living in a toxic environment with a child who was at best obnoxious, and at worst volatile and dangerous. When Scarlet's husband Geoffrey came into the kitchen, he observed his wife staring out at Petra's old house. She had her hands immersed under the soapy suds at the kitchen sink, and appeared to be locked in a strange trance, as if her mind was 1,000 miles away. He noticed she wasn't even washing the dishes. He knew his wife had been hit hard by Petra Stewart's death, but ever since the new lady had moved in next door, it hadn't escaped his attention that his wife had grown increasingly off-colour, and recently she had even snapped at their own children. She seemed to be a little on edge, and he meant to get to the bottom of his wife's incongruous, irrational behaviour. "Hello, sweetheart," he said, coming into the kitchen, planting a kiss on her cheeks. "Is everything all right? You seem a wee bit off-colour. For the last few minutes your eyes have been fixed on Petra's old house. Are you still upset about the old woman's death?" "Of course I'm upset about losing Petra, but it's not that. Have you seen the woman that's moved in next door?" "No, I can't say I have." "She's a dead ringer for my late sister Ella." "Oh dear, that's not good. If she looks like your late sister, it's bound to unearth some horrifying memories for you."
But you must remember, she can't hurt you now. Your sister's dead. You're perfectly safe. I'm sure the neighbour is a very nice woman, even if she is a doppelganger to your sister. That's the way it often is. People often look alike. It's the way the world works. What's her name, by the way? The next-door neighbour, I mean.
Constance Cunningham.
Well, what I'm trying to say to you, sweetheart, is just because she looks like your sister doesn't mean she's similar in character. Two apples might look exactly the same, but can taste remarkably different. Haven't you found that before?
That is true, Scarlett agreed, when you put it like that.
So you do appreciate, then, that maybe this Constance woman, who unfortunately bears a remarkable resemblance to Ella, is probably a very, very nice woman. You should give her a chance before judging her so unfairly. It's a pity for her that she looks like Ella, but that is hardly her fault.
You're probably right. I know I should go around there and welcome her to the neighbourhood, but I can't bring myself to do it, based on the way she looks.
I'm sure when you do finally meet her, sweetheart, you'll be pleasantly surprised.
You think so? Asked Scarlett doubtfully.
I certainly do,
he said. So there we are, that's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.